Hi and welcome to Military Diorama. Today's video is part 2 in the Takom Merkava Mk1 hybrid build, and today we'll be painting the tank. I'm going to be doing a pre-shading method which I don't normally do, but it should be fun, so I hope you enjoy. I've left the wheels loose, so before we get the primer down I'm going to remove the turret and the wheels and do those separately. I always try and leave as many parts removable as possible. It just makes the painting process easier, especially when you can get under the hull. If you've got to do the dirt effects and mud effects, if you can get the wheels off or leave them removable, then it just makes it a lot easier. With Sherman tanks, I normally leave the bogies built but not attached to the lower hull, just so you can get in and do the weathering easily. With those removed, I start the priming. I'm using Vallejo black primer, which is 70602. I'm using a Harden Steinbach Evolution Silverline, which has got a 0.4mm needle. I don't always use this airbrush. I've got other ones. So I've got some cheaper ones that I use sometimes. I like this airbrush. It's quite nice. I don't worry too much about air pressure. I just make sure the paint is coming out nice and smooth, not splattering, and just make sure it's going down nicely before I start actually applying it to the model. As I said before, I'm not used to doing pre-shading. I normally just do normal modulation. But I just thought it'd make a nice change, especially for this paint, as it's onto a textured tank. I've never done textured tanks before, so I thought might as well do two things at the same time. But I start off with the upper hull and the turret ring, and as I move around, making sure I get all the paint into all the edges, move out slowly, doing all the panel lines, all the recess detail, also doing the engine grates and stuff, painting those black. Just getting into all the nooks and crannies, and then leave that to dry. As I'm leaving it to dry, I'll move around the vehicle, and then if I need to touch any more up, I will do. I also repeat the process on the running gear, the lower hull and the turret, making sure that I do the bottom of the turret as well, but just getting in all the nooks and crannies, all the panel lines, behind all the extra bits and stuff, so that if you miss something with a Cyanide Grey or whatever colour it is you're spraying, it will look like a shadow. If you need to get in somewhere close, I suggest lowering the air pressure so you can get the airbrush in quite tight. That way it will stop it from spider webbing. But yeah, just get in all the nooks and crannies, all the panel lines, and just make sure you get it all covered. If you're pre-shading, obviously don't do the entire vehicle because that defeats the object of it. I'll go back over this later with some lighter paint for the highlights. But yeah, just make sure you get in all the nooks and crannies. After I'm happy with the black shadows applied, I move on to the grey, which is Vallejo 70601, and that's also primer. I fill in the centre of the panels and also the centres of any high points on the vehicle, going from the upper hull, the turret, and some of the lower hull and wheels, just highlighting any areas, and the highest of the areas I put a good coat on, just making a good contrast between the low and the high areas and the panel lines and the centre of the panels. Again, no particular air pressure. I just make sure the paint's come out nice and smooth. I don't change or I don't clean the brush between each colour. I just make sure that there's a small amount of colour in the cup, so when the black runs out, I'll either put a little bit more in or I'll change the colour to the grey. I put some paint retarder in to keep it flowing nicely. I also make sure I keep a Q-tip handy and some kitchen roll so I can spray the airbrush out, keep the nozzle clean, and keep the tip clean with a Q-tip. After I'm done with the grey, I put a little bit of hemp in, which is 71023. I just do this to soften the transition from the black to the grey, and I do it mainly around, I guess, the dirty areas like the turret ring and the lower hull, and where the armour would meet the side skirts, just so it's a bit more of a smooth transition from the black to the black to the grey. Once I'm happy with the hemp layer that I've done on the upper and the lower hull and the running gear, I clean the airbrush out and move on to the Cyanide Grey, which is Vallejo 71141, which is Cyanide Grey 73, which is the correct colour for this vehicle because it predates the colour change in 1982, I think, which is 711 142, the colour for Vallejo, for the later Sinai Grey. As I've mentioned before, I'm not used to doing this sort of technique, so with the Cyanide Gray I added about 25% airbrush thinners, so the paint is more translucent, there's less pigment, so it makes it easier to lay the paint down without obscuring the pre-shading, because there'd be no point doing the pre-shading if I obscured it all. And I'll go over the entire tank with this coat. I did notice while I was painting that because it's got the anti-slip texture on it, that you've got to spray from all four angles or all around the tank, because if you hit the front from just the front, then when the tank's turned round, the back of the anti-slip will still be the original colour before you sprayed it. Also, a little interesting fact, it's not actually anti-slip. The Israelis applied it to the vehicles because it absorbed the light, so it made the vehicles harder to see in the desert, because obviously in the desert there's not really much need for anti-slip because it's not wet, but that is why they applied the grit to make the tank more matte and just settle into the background. Interesting fact. Again, I do this on the upper and lower hull, the turret and the running gear. I try and avoid the parts where I've applied hemp to the under the bottom side of the turret and around the turret ring, because that would get a bit dirty, so I'm trying to leave that there so it's like a bit of a pre-dirtying paint job sort of thing. But once I'm happy with the effect I've got with this coat of Cyanide Grey, I add a small amount of grey, not sure which one it was just a light grey, as in like just a couple of drops to the paint cup. I actually take the paint out of the paint cup and put it in a little mixing pot, top it off with Cyanide Grey, and then I add a small amount of grey to it, 3 or 4 drops, just so there's a visible change in colour, and then repeat the process again, and I do this 3 or 4 times, so it's got 4 layers of highlights. Again, just taking the paint out of the airbrush, putting it back into the paint pot before remixing it again, cleaning the airbrush out on some kitchen roll, just so you've got a nice clean colour, and the new colour is coming out when you start. Working to the centre of the panels, and of course trying not to cover up the pre-shading, and just getting a nice even coat and a nice even transition from the colours. Again, thinning it out with the airbrush thinners, and also with, I put the paint retardant on as well so it doesn't clog up the brush. Keeping a Q-tip handy and some kitchen roll handy, just so you can clean the airbrush out, or the tip off, sorry. Another little note, if you are using thinning your paint down with thinners or flow improver, then once the paint has dried it will lose its opacity, so you might think you've overdone it, or when you've finished spraying it's dried off you might think that you haven't sprayed it. It's just worth giving it another couple of, not full coats, but waiting for it to dry and making sure you're happy with it, and if not, just going back over again with the same colour, as it's more translucent, so there's less pigment in it, and you might just have to go over it again. But I just find it easier in this instance because of the free shading. And with each of the lighter layers that you do, I'm just making sure that I'm working into the centre of the panel, missing the panel lines out, so that you're getting a nice highlight and a nice contrast. I tend not to use the lighter colours on the side and the lower hull, so once I get to the second highlight, I'll stop doing the wheels and the lower hull, and then I'll concentrate on the upper hull, and then again with the lightest of the highlight, it will just be a high up coat, so right on the tops of things. Also, as I increase the highlight level, say from 1 through to 4, I also tend to spray at a higher angle, so that you're not getting the lighter paint into and around areas, so you still got fake shadows, if that makes any sense. Just being clever with the way you spray and letting the dark area remain dark so that it keeps the shadow there. Once the base paint modulation is done, I move on to the brush detail, doing a bit of blocking in. I'm doing the mud flaps in dark rubber, which is 70306, I think, Panzer Races. I also use this for the rubbers on the wheels. I do the rubbers on the flaps at the front, I do it in a downward motion, which will emphasise the weathering the texture that I put onto them during the construction. Just makes them look more rubbery. Also, the side rubber flap on the front and the front rubber flap, they're moulded as if they're one piece, but they're actually split on the side. So the side one is separate to the front one. But I do this on the front and the rear rubber flaps and also the road wheels. What I'll do afterwards with the damage I've done to the road wheels, I'll go over some of the chips in the rubbers of the road wheels with a lighter rubber tone and some of the darker rubber tone, because it will look like some of them are fresher than others, just adding a bit more interest to the kit. Once I've done all the rubber parts, I move on to the canvas on the gun cover and the rear. I can't remember the colour I used, it was some Vallejo brown colour. But once I've done that, I move on to the rear brake lights, where I use Vallejo flat red, which is Panzerrace's 70957. Well, that's all the blocking done. Next I move on to the brush highlights, where I lighten the Cyanide Grey with some lighter grey and just go over all of the high up areas and things that stand out, like grab handles, hinges. For example, there's some parts on the side of the turret by the vision slits and there's ridges on it. I paint the raised ridges with a lighter colour. Just anything that stands out, really, just to give it a bit more of a pop. Especially with the anti-slip texture, the metal parts on top of that, there's some dividers or mounts for things. Just paint those with a lighter colour, it gives it a bit more contrast. Edges of panels, like where it's been welded up, so the top edge, not the actual top of the hull, but the edge where it meets the hull, just do the top edge of that. The top of the turret basket, parts on the radiator antennas and stuff, the the straps for the thermal coating on the barrel, just areas like that to give it a bit more of a contrasting colour. I do this on the road wheels as well. I paint the outer rim of the wheel in the lighter colour, and also the nuts and bolts on the inside of the wheel a lighter colour. It just makes the painting stand out a little bit more, gives it a bit more contrast, especially when you put a wash onto it to get in to highlight the edges, like a pin wash. And it looks a bit stark, but once you start putting the washes on, it will blend it all in. In these stills, I've highlighted some areas that I have or will highlight. Again, like I say, it's just things that pop out and make a good contrast, especially for when you're adding a wash and filters. It does look quite stark, but it just gets toned down once you apply washes and stuff to it. It's just a guide of where I apply highlights. On these balls I haven't done it yet, but I will do. I hope you've enjoyed the video. If you have, please consider subscribing, leave a like, leave a comment. I'd be happy to answer any questions you have. And I'll see you next week. I'll leave you some stills of the finished tank.